So in this video, we're going to talk about something called inertia. Now, I don't mean the kind of inertia you feel on a Monday morning when you can't get out of bed. Actually, kind of similar, because inertia is the property of an object that makes it want to stay doing what it's doing. It's kind of like a resistance to change. So if something is stationary, then it wants to stay stationary. And if something is moving, it wants to stay moving. And this actually has quite an important effect on our electricity grids. Back in the bad old days of fossil fuel and nuclear power generation, before our enlightened new era of unicorn farts and rainbows, there were things called generators and turbines. Most electricity was generated by boiling water to make steam and then using that steam to turn a turbine, which then drove a generator to produce the electricity. Now, those turbines were massive. The combination of a turbine and a generator together had so much mass that once it was rotating, it didn't want to change. It wanted to keep rotating at that same speed. And that is what keeps the grid stable. Our mains electricity is alternating current, which means it oscillates up and down, backwards and forwards, and it happens 50 times a second. It's 50 hertz. You often hear that hum from electric motors or speakers, because that is the frequency at which the mains electricity is oscillating. And that comes directly from the generators, which were rotating at 3000 RPM, which produced an exactly stable 50 hertz. Now, it's very important that the whole grid stays synchronized at 50 hertz. If additional load is applied to the grid, then that has a tendency to want to slow down the generators, because the generator is having to work harder to create the electricity for that extra demand. But the fact that these turbines and generators were so massive, they could resist that kind of demand change. They had so much inertia that it kept the grid stable. It kept the frequency stable. But the problem is that now we don't have turbines generating electricity anymore. We have wind farms and solar panels. Wind farms are completely asynchronous in the sense that they don't have any frequency. It depends on how fast the wind is blowing, and solar panels are exactly the same. They produce direct current anyway, so it has to be converted into an alternating current at 50 hertz and then synchronized with the rest of the grid. Wind farms are even harder because obviously the frequency that they generate at is going to vary, so they have to have complex electronics to match the frequency being generated by the wind farms with the grid frequency. But the problem with all of this is that there is no inertia in the system. So if there is a massive spike in demand, that will naturally drag down the frequency of the grid. And once the grid gets out of sync by a tiny, tiny fraction of 1 hertz, then things get shut off just to protect them from damage. This is the reality of a renewable grid that doesn't have baseload power generation based on heavy rotating turbines and generators. It doesn't have the inertia to cope with spikes in power demand. If you've got a bunch of nuclear, fossil-fueled, gas-powered generators all generating at 50 hertz with massive turbines that have huge amounts of inertia, the grid is stable. It will cope with changes in demand pretty well. But now, in this era of renewables, where all we've got is wind farms and solar panels, both of which are completely asynchronous to the grid, then you're going to have problems. And that's precisely what they're hinting has happened in this massive blackout in Spain. As this article from The Telegraph reports, blackout risk made worse by net zero. Experts say reliance on solar and wind power risks making grid more vulnerable to outages. Exactly right. A reliance on net zero energy left Spain and Portugal vulnerable to the mass blackouts engulfing the region, experts said on Monday night. In what is believed to be Europe's largest power cut, tens of millions of people were left without electricity, while flights were grounded, trains halted, and whole cities were left without power, internet access, or other vital services. The cause of the initial fault in the region's electricity grid is still being investigated, and the EU has insisted that there were no indications that it was a cyber attack. Well, thank heaven for small mercies. However, energy experts have blamed a heavy reliance on solar and wind farms in Spain for leaving the region's power grid vulnerable to such a crisis. A state of emergency was declared in Spain, while in Portugal, water company EPAL said supplies could also be disrupted. Queues formed at shops of people seeking to purchase emergency supplies like gas lights, generators and batteries. Welcome to the new world of renewable power grids, people. Energy operators are fighting to restore power in Spain, Portugal and parts of France, and residents are being urged to avoid travel and use mobile phones sparingly. And here we get to exactly what I've just been saying. Traditional energy systems have mechanisms which allow them to keep running even if there is a shock, such as a surge or loss of power. However, solar and wind do not have the same ability. Electricity grids need what is known as inertia to help balance the network and maintain electricity supplies at a stable frequency. Inertia is created by generators with spinning parts, such as turbines running on gas, coal or hydropower, which wind and solar do not have. Britain's National Energy Systems operator, NESO, compares it to the shock absorbers in your car's suspension, which dampen the effect of a sudden bump in the road and keep your car stable and moving forward. Catherine Porter, an independent energy analyst, said, "In a low inertia environment, the frequency can change much faster. If you have had a significant grid fault in one area or a cyber attack or whatever it may be, the grid operators therefore have less time to react. That can lead to cascading failures if you cannot get it under control quickly." The European Court of Auditors, an arm's-length body that oversees EU spending, warned earlier this month that the growth of renewables was making it harder to balance the grids of different countries. It said in a report, renewable energy sources have higher intermittency and variability because their output depends on weather conditions, unlike traditional power plants that can adjust output to meet demand. This, in turn, makes balancing the system more challenging. Consequently, grid reinforcement, the installation of specific equipment and more modern, smart and innovative technologies may be required to accommodate these energy sources. So translating that, it just means that a renewable grid based on wind and solar is a hell of a lot more unstable and more complex than a regular grid based on turbine generation. It's just another nail in the coffin of renewable energy grids. As well as being vastly more expensive, despite what people tell you, the electricity is way more expensive from renewables than it is from baseload fossil fuels or nuclear. Not only is it less resilient to wind and weather, not only is the infrastructure more complex because you have to connect these acres of wind farms and solar panels together, but also you have to somehow integrate that with the frequency stability of the grid to ensure that it doesn't collapse like it just did in Spain. Quite frankly, it is phenomenal that so many politicians continue to push the lie that renewables are somehow better than baseload fossil fuel or nuclear generation. How they can continue to tell this lie is just unbelievable. And here we have a classic example of what happens when a renewable grid faces the kind of challenge that 30 years ago would probably not even have been noticed. Absolute madness.